Great. Okay, thank you. Now, you just had another election,
Yeah, 3 weeks ago.
and the cricket guy got it,
Yeah.
passing it around. Now, what's he going to be like?
Let's see. I'm a little nervous because he has pandered a lot to a lot of our extreme right-wing groups. At the same time, he's also pushed for social reform and agenda, and he doesn't have any corruption charges on him. He's very clean that way. I don't know. Let's see.
Now, what percentage is the Shia population of Pakistan?
About 12%.
Well, so that could be, I mean, given the depth of the divide, which I assume has become greater over the last 20, 30 years.
It has its ebbs and flows, so it's kind of hard to kind of decide what parameters you're looking at in terms of those divisions. But certainly when politics and elections happen, many politicians do pander to those specific extreme groups to foster those divisions, to get their constituencies and political backing. So.
And Musharraf is Sunni?
Musharraf is Sunni, yeah.
And so basically all the leadership in Pakistan over these years, the presidents, the prime ministers.
Zardari was a president who was Shia, but he wasn't like pronounced himself. And so was Benazir, apparently.
Okay. During the, during the early 1980s, there was the whole, the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, the warlords essentially were opposing secular government in Karachi, in Kabul, in Afghanistan. I mean, there was a whole interesting drama around that. A move towards democracy in Afghanistan, the election of a leader who was opposed by the tribal lords, the killing of the defense minister in Kabul, the mobilization of the Russians to try to shore up the secular government in Kabul, the United States coming in and supporting the Mujahideen and giving strength and ultimately against...
Birth to the Taliban.
Huh?
Birth to the Taliban.
And birth to the Taliban. So the United States was in fact involved and substantially in giving birth to the Taliban.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think my previous film, Among the Believers, covers more on that issue. But contextually, yes, you're right. During the Cold War, towards the end of it, when the Soviets were trying to take over Afghanistan, the United States concocted this policy with Pakistan in coalition to back Afghan Mujahideen tribal lords, fund them, send them to madrasas, to instruct them in this very puritanical ideology to go wage jihad against the godless Soviets. And once the Soviets were defeated, the Americans said, well, okay, thanks, and they left. And then Pakistan had, you know, thousands of these bloodthirsty warriors in our backyard and also in our country, with no rehabilitation program, with nothing. I don't know if you guys have seen Charlie Wilson's War.
Right.
They go into a little bit of that, where Tom Hanks plays Charlie Wilson, the senator. At that time, after the war was over, he was trying to actually get USAID and for some of these rehab programs to reassimilate some of those jihadi warriors back into mainstream society, create some sort of a functional government. But the United States wasn't interested because they defeated the Soviets, and so they left.
It's a short-term strategy.
Yeah, and so what ends up happening is the Taliban rise in Afghanistan, and Pakistan decides, well, we have all these soldiers, we might as well use them as a covert strategy in a proxy war against our real enemy, India. And they started doing that there, and then also in Kashmir, the disputed land. And then, of course, years later, 9/11 happens, and that short-term strategy came to back the United States. So,
Right.
yeah.
The chicken's coming home to roost. Anyway, complicated politics. And obviously the United States war in Afghanistan has not really improved the situation terribly. The Taliban is probably stronger today than it has ever been in some ways, yes? I mean, I don't know.
I mean, there are other groups also. So for example, now you have ISIL, and in Afghanistan you have ISIL and Taliban also involved in a fight amongst each other to try to kind of gain control.
So ISIL and Taliban are fighting each other in Afghanistan.
Yeah.
And of course in Iraq as well, there was a strategy at one point to try to co-opt the Sunni, the disenfranchised Sunni minority in Iraq. General Petraeus was involved in that. There were like $30 a month to 140,000 Sunni who had been disenfranchised as a result of the American war and the coming to power of Shia, and then leaving Iraq and having no provision for what you do to continue enfranchising the Sunni, who then, disillusioned, start making alliances with ISIS.
And that's how ISIL rose, exactly, after the Iraq war.
So it's very complicated. Is there any possibility for reconciliation between the Shia and the Sunni?
Of course there is, but I think it's a lot of outside influences and foreign countries playing their own power games. Iran and Saudi Arabia are extremely complicit in that. Iran is a predominantly Shia country. Saudi Arabia is a predominantly Sunni Wahhabi country. And they use other countries in the Middle East and in South Asia and other Muslim countries to increase their sphere of influence.
Right.
And religion is a great tool in doing that. There was always some sectarian tension, even since Pakistan was formed in the 1940s, 1947 onwards. But it was nothing like what I witnessed when I was growing up in my age group, in the 80s and 90s.
So growing up, did you have Sunni friends?
Of course.
In school? Yeah. So really, in some ways, and I think, so Saudi Arabia and Iran could make a huge difference if they were to actually, because they're both also relatively rich countries, to play a constructive role in the region to dissipate this tension and to look at their, instead, a positive leadership role to help develop education, to help develop economic development, to help, because that obviously I think would probably be helpful too, yes?
Right, well, Iran is not necessarily a rich country. Saudi Arabia definitely is. Iran definitely has a strong sphere of influence purely because of its basically becoming the bastion of Shia Islam. But it would be in favor of their geopolitical ambitions, nor would it be in the favor of all their allies, aka the United States for Saudi Arabia, or the USSR for Iran, so it won't be in their interests either.
Yeah.
And so that's where you have outside powers coming to play to stop that from happening.
All right, I have some other questions, but why don't we see if anybody in the audience has something they want to bring up. Yes, sir.
Yeah, how did you get the footage of the meeting between Musharraf and the senator? Was that you filming? Okay, and do you believe him when he says he had no clue that bin Laden was living next door to him?
I don't necessarily believe him. I think that there might have been people that were underneath him in the intelligence agencies that reported to him that knew exactly what they were doing. And they had probably housed Osama bin Laden to use as a bargaining chip at some later date with the American government. And Musharraf purposely probably turned a blind eye so he could have plausible deniability. So that's what I think. I think he didn't know, but he knew. If that is, yeah. So
Seymour Hersh has written a book on, maybe it's just an article, I don't know. Have you read Seymour Hersh's article, which basically makes that allegation that there were elements in Pakistani intelligence who did know about Osama bin Laden, and in fact that Obama had used those elements to make the successful mission. But in other words, the United States did not go in there simply based on its own intelligence. That they had co-opted some elements in Pakistani intelligence. I don't think that Hersh pointed a finger at Musharraf specifically, indicated that the United States did work with elements in Pakistani intelligence to carry out the raid, frankly, to have protection to get in and out, and that.
Yeah, I believe that. Yeah, that seems right.
And given also the way, if you really get into how intelligence interactions take place, there are camps, there are individuals, there's loads of potential for corruption. Even in the United States, things like the Bay of Pigs invasion, there were various forces, some of which were privately funded, some of which were publicly funded. These things happen.
Our intelligence agency is not a monolith.
Right.
There's divisions within.
There are divisions, and so different strategies are pursued in that regard. Yes, over here.
Yeah, just one comment or one question. So regarding your the last comments, actually, this recent disclosure 2 weeks ago about possible payments by the Obama administration to actually facilitate the attack on the Laden. But that's
payments by the Obama administration, payments to whom?
To
To Pakistani intelligence, Pakistani government?
Yes, and implying the intelligence. But this is again, it's allegations. But this is recent news about 2 weeks ago.
Yeah.
My question to you is, if you were able to advise, going back to 2001, if you were able to advise the U.S., what would you have recommended to do? Your positions to in terms of making recommendations to the U.S. administration in order to deal with the conflict in Pakistan. What would your recommendations have been?
Oh, well, I wouldn't be so arrogant to presume that I'm that well versed in public policy or anything. I'm just a filmmaker. But I think one thing that was obvious was that they probably should have focused more on soft power initiatives. Whether that was building infrastructure in schools and these kinds of things. I'll just give you an example. If you saw me speaking to my security guard, Kareem, right? His constituency, they support the Taliban. But there's a reason that they support the Taliban. It's because, at least in his region, they're building roads, they're bringing electricity in, they're opening up schools for children, right? Rather than attacking and destroying his village with drones. So people remember that, right? So they'll remember these kinds of initiatives. It's not like they're ideologically now going to all of a sudden turn, towards the Taliban. Even Kareem is like, yeah, these guys are nuts. We realize that. But, so those kinds of initiatives would have helped. But then, I remember being in New York at that time, just right after 9/11, and the country's mood was very, very different, and I don't know if any leader, or maybe, certainly not Bush, people really, I guess, I felt, maybe I'm wrong, they wanted blood.
Yeah, I mean, yeah.
So,
There are a couple of things I think that come to mind. One is, what would $20 billion of Pakistan have done for, economic development, instead of military development? That's one question. The other thing is interesting in that the scene you filmed with the American politicians, the guy said, look, we don't care about poverty. We're not interested that you reduce poverty. We're interested in the war on terror. So I thought that was also telling. And it's the nature of the aid that gets distributed. So that's another issue. We had a meeting, we had a film here the other day, Dateline Saigon, I don't know if anybody saw it, but David Halberstam, who was a really important journalist during the Vietnam War, reported that he went to a meeting of high-level former and current American intelligence officials within 4 days of 9/11 and came out of it saying that there was consensus. A, don't do what they want you to do, which is to make war. And B, constructively engage the region to dry up the swamp, because there was basically agreement that there were essentially 2,000 Al-Qaeda agents in the world at that point who could be isolated through a significant cultural initiative into the Middle East based on economic development, based on support for education, based on support for women's participation in public life. And this was largely ignored, obviously. The New York Times also reported that the Taliban offered to hand over bin Laden if he would be tried in an Arab nation, in a Sharia court. But that was also ignored, and I think this thirst for blood was part of that. But it was an important moment because the United States was also getting expressions of support from Iran after 9/11, from a very broad base of countries. So I think that, this is the question, do you go diplomacy, and then of course the war on Iraq, it's just like, what?
yeah.
Anyway, so I think that this question, somebody, because we discuss this, we think about it, what could have Obama done, blah, blah, blah. Well, how about an international, and this actually James Baker talked about this, of all people, Secretary of State under Ronald Reagan, said, we need a massive regional conference on peace and stability in the Middle East. And to my mind, you also put $3 trillion of development aid on the table at that meeting. You get Saudi Arabia, Iran, American oil company. Look at all of the money that's been made out of the Middle East, with ironically such underdevelopment still. And let's do a crash course on massive support for the region, for people of goodwill and to avoid, corruption, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, it's a long discussion, but would that not be better than where we are right now?
Certainly, but as you can see, this is something I feel that's universal, not just in Pakistan, but even here. Sometimes short-term dramatic strategies are more effective for winning votes, certainly, and contributing to political theater.
Although Americans are tired, I think, of the wars. There's statistics that show that, 17 years, where are we with it? But yes, question.
I was actually super curious about the birth of the film. I realize you're friends with his nephew, and that might have gotten you like an interview or something, or like a little short, this is a video. What drove him to let you follow him for so long? What did he get out of it? I get what you got out of it, but what was sort of driving his involvement, do you think?
Well, I had a fairly long production process. I filmed him for about 5 years. And exactly right, the first time I met him, it was because of my friend who happened to be his nephew. And he put me in touch with his press attaché, and it just got me one interview. And then slowly over that entire course of production, I kept on pushing again and again. And my access kind of grew from there. And we kind of formed our own friendship and all that. He was, keep in mind, just had been humiliated and been sent into exile, been overthrown as a dictator. And, he likes the camera. I don't know if you guys could pick up on that. And, he's a bit of a narcissist.
He looks good looking guy.
But I mean, you
Dresses
have a
well.
world leader zipping his fly. Like, that is some access, right?
Yeah, he's a bit, I mean, and that was, by the way, really shocking to me, that like how Mr. Magoo kind of actually was. Yeah, and here was someone who was making a film on him. So he signed up for that and he thought this is a great idea.
He needed friends.
And, someone was paying attention to him, so he allowed me. I mean, this is not the only time, I get asked similar questions like this with my previous film, Among the Believers, because I was also making this other film in which I follow a Taliban support, this cleric who runs a really notorious madrasa called the Red Mosque in Islamabad. Maulana Abdulaziz, he's the cleric of that. He's been convicted several times on various terrorism charges. He has been part of the Taliban. He's a supporter of ISIL. And I also followed him for 5 years. Very different character. And I think very similar strategy in terms of how I got access to him too. These guys kind of felt that they were getting their own platform to clarify their own story. And my approach, at least, this film, of course, is a lot more subjective because it's my own personal viewpoint. Having said that, I tried my best to make it very observational as well, in the sense that I left in huge swaths of verite scenes in this film and the previous one, where I really leave it up to the audience to judge.
Yeah. Who here comes away with a more dimensional view of Musharraf by watching this film? Yes. I mean, it's not necessarily pro-Musharraf, right? But it's more complicated. And who also comes away wondering how much courage it takes for this guy to make these movies. I mean, it's like... I mean, all three of these films, Shame, Among the Believers, this film, all of them are films that could easily place you in danger. And we saw some emails and Facebook stuff where people are threatening you.
Yeah. Well, a lot of my body of work kind of puts me in danger, at least back home. So
Don't you have a security guard?
Yeah, I do.
Yes. Who else here would like to have a security guard? Okay. Yes.
I just want to ask a question about the new Prime Minister. Is he, he's not Shia? Is
No.
he Ismail?
No.
No, he's Sunni.
He's Sunni.
Sorry, what was the question?
The new Prime Minister.
Well, the new Prime Minister is...
The new Prime
Shia.
Minister, Imran Khan, whether he is a Shia or a Sunni Muslim, he's a Sunni Muslim.
And do you think he will be good for your country?
I don't know. Jay asked me that when we first started. Insha'Allah, I don't know. Let's see. I'm a bit nervous and hesitant because this campaign that he ran, I mean, he really cowed down to a lot of some crazy right-wing elements, the equivalent of like Tea Party people, or the Ku Klux Klan equivalent of this country. His politics himself are kind of center-right. He does have a completely clean record, but he's also very mercurial, and he does some very, very strange things. Having said that, his recent speeches, I have to admit, his rhetoric is on point, where he wants to focus on social reform, education, civil human rights, so that's great. How will he be able to, given some of his supporter base? Remains to be seen. So
Issues of the drone strikes were in the news a lot under Obama. Now, part of the issue now is that Trump is in the news all the time, everywhere. Are there still drone strikes? I mean, I'm not even aware whether there's been a change in the number of drone strikes.
there are still drone strikes, but they're a lot less. I mean, I do have to say, this is something that would be surprising. Under the Bush's administration, there were way fewer drone attacks. So if I could give you a number, I think from the periods of 2004 till about 2008 or 9, there are a total of, I'm approximating here, about 40 or 50 drone attacks. I mean, something a very small, negligible number. The next year that increased to something like 300, and then the following year, 400 and 500. So Obama was a lot more excessive and brutal in terms of a military strategy than even Bush, especially using drone attacks.
Yeah, interesting. Other questions? Sir?
I have a question about, since you kind of had this up close personal view, do you think that President Musharraf was for the country prior to 9/11, or did he just happen to be, at the right time, the move was okay, and then when 9/11 hit, all games changed? What's your viewpoint on how he was for the country?
You mean pre-9/11?
Yeah.
Pre-9/11, people really loved him. They really, really did. Because he was pushing for economic reform, and he was doing all these things that, frankly, many benevolent dictators the world over do, where in the short term, they'll put on, like a showboat and get results and won't have to worry about pesky parliament, trying to stop reform and things like this. So he was decisive, and he got things done, and people really loved him for it. The thing is, and this is the thing that I learned with making this film, in the long term that has a lot more harm than good. And your civil institutions, which are something that gets strengthened through the democratic process over time, that never happens. So let's say even if Musharraf is amazing and he's great, the minute he's out of there, we're back to point zero, and we haven't really solidified or strengthened as a country. That's deeply problematic. And of course, taking the right for self-determination and all that's pretty immoral, right? Yeah. And that's something I learned overall. Otherwise, I was a full-on supporter too.
Let's take one more question, yeah?
Thank you, Mr. Naqvi.
Maybe we'll take a second one.
Peace, I really enjoyed it.
Thanks.
This is kind of a follow-on to the question I asked earlier, what the genesis of this project was. And I guess the follow-on is, can you express what your personal motivation was in starting this project? And then if there were a couple of major things that either surprised you about where you ended up when you got to the end, or that you might want to comment on this?
Sure. Well, like when I first started this project, I wanted to make a simple bio piece, somewhat of like a comeback story, I was a huge fan of Musharraf, and I felt that he had been wronged a lot in the press, and it was unfair. And so I wanted to kind of rectify that for him. But then I got to know him personally. And it wasn't me like learning about him through the lens of newspapers or talk shows. It was one-on-one, very intimate. And of course I was never blind to his flaws before, but I understood that those were some pragmatic decisions he had to take. But then when Osama bin Laden was caught, and then how he denied that, and then eventually even admitted to me that he actually did support the Taliban initially, and actually was complicit in creating the general unsafety that existed in Pakistan. Then I was like, okay. And my story took a totally different turn. I was never supposed to be in this film. In fact, I had 2 previous cuts. I was not in the film at all. It was purely observational, and I was following him as he attempted for a comeback. And while I was fond of those cuts, ultimately it wasn't that intriguing. I reluctantly, or that wasn't that, it wasn't such a fascinating story. I think what ended up being really important was just my own relationship with him and how that evolved, just being a potential voter myself. Because my story is not very specific to me, it's actually representative of a large swath of voters in Pakistan.
I was struck by how, if I had to pick a theme, I get to the end, the one that hit me really hard, and it wasn't obvious until I just processed it, powerlessness. It was amazing to me to take someone like Musharraf, or someone who's in power, and not just describing his being out of power, but when he was in power, this just overwhelming sense of absolute helplessness in the face of forces that he had no control over.
Mm-hmm. And at the same token, I think he did, in the few decisions that he did have power over, that he could have actually influenced really good, he still kind of fell short. And ultimately, my journey of disillusionment and, I think that's kind of what started fascinating me more. And then that's why in this final cut I decided to put myself in, although it wasn't ever planned.
But you don't really do a hatchet job on Musharraf either. I mean, he does come through, as I say, with more dimension than we would have otherwise, and in ways that both, I think, that shaded both ways. I think that's interesting. What's your next project?
Well, actually, before you mention that, that was actually, one of my cuts was kind of a hatchet job.
Uh-huh.
And then I was like, well, what do I get out of that? What does anyone get out of that? It was also not totally fair to my experience of this man. Was he manipulating me while I was with him? Certainly, maybe. I leave that for the audience to decide. He didn't want to make a movie, first of all, on it. But I think with a hatchet job, it's like this. Let's say maybe one day make a movie on Trump, and I make an hour and a half of just railing on him and hating on him. It kind of gets boring, like 5-10 minutes in.
Sure.
Right? So I wanted to kind of go beyond that. I wanted to transcend that, and so that's why I thought that this approach was more universal. So at least for Pakistan, this is actually a hopeful story, because despite our many, many issues, we are an amazingly resilient country, and we are still chugging on, and that's kind of great. And I wanted to kind of make a country make a movie kind of celebrating that, My next film, I can't talk too much about it, but it's centered around the blasphemy laws. If you're familiar with what the blasphemy laws are, it's basically if you take the prophet's name in the vain, or you burn the Quran, or say something that's considered blasphemous against Islam, you can actually be put to death. And this is a law that's active in Pakistan. And currently I'm making a movie on that, which is very much modeled after The Crucible, in which I'm following 2 live cases of people who've been accused of blasphemy, and I'm telling it through the point of view of the Grand Inquisitor, the one who decides whether to put them to death or not.
Salman Rushdie.
Well, he was accused of blasphemy, which is why he ended up in the States.
And how much you're spending part of your time in Pakistan and part of your time in New York? What's the mix at this point? How much in New York and how much in Pakistan?
Well, let's see. So far, for the last few years, it's kind of been evenly split. I think maybe the next few years I'll probably be about like 60% in New York, the rest in Pakistan or London, where some of the other projects that I'm working on are based. So
Cool. And you went to NYU Film School, right?
no, I went to UPenn.
Oh, University of Pennsylvania.
Yeah, I went to UPenn.
And they had a film program, a good film program?
They actually were just starting when I was there. They developed a more robust film program after I left.
Uh-huh.
I was actually a theater arts major, so they had like a theater program.
Mhm.
I was always interested, of course, in storytelling and film, but when I moved to New York, which was in August of 2001,
Wow.
that kind of what happened the next month, of course, really informed me as an artist because, of course, being a Muslim Pakistani American and growing in New York at that time, I never looked at my background or where I was from with such in such detail. I never questioned it or anything like that. And it just naturally made sense for me at that time to go into nonfiction as a medium, to use in storytelling, and I think the rest is history, I guess.
Yeah. Well, it's extraordinary, the subjects that you've taught. We'll take one more, yes.
Has Musharraf seen this film?
Yes, he has.
And what's been his response to it?
Overall, he kind of liked it. He was fine with it. He did have issues with the scene in which he goes to meet the U.S. congressmen and senators, and they basically asked for their covert support. He wanted me to take that out. I said, no, I can't do that. And then he was like, but I treated you like family, and you betrayed me. And I did feel guilty. I still kind of feel guilty about that a little bit. But I realized that, intellectually, it's absolutely my right to show this. But I always get attached to my characters, even Maulana Abdulaziz, who's the cleric of the Red Mosque, who's really frightening and scary. It's just natural, I guess, but yeah. So.
Yeah, well, again, Mo, you show courage and vision, and what you're doing is very important in a time and in a world where there is so much misunderstanding, to help bridge that gap and add dimension to our understanding. So thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. Thanks.